Whoever's dressing you for work these days ought to be fired, and so should whoever let you ride up here with actual executives," the man in the charcoal suit said, glancing at the frayed seam on Elias Vance's shoulder like it was something he might catch, and the elevator doors slid shut on the two of them before Elias had even decided whether the comment deserved an answer. "If you have ever been measured by your clothes before anyone bothered to ask your name, I think you already know exactly how that elevator felt, and I think you should keep watching. Before we get into it, if stories like this one speak to you, this channel has more of them, quiet stories about fathers, about dignity, about the moment the truth finally catches up to the noise. Now let's go back to where it started, because nothing about that elevator ride made sense until you understood the ordinary Thursday that came before it. It began on an ordinary Thursday morning in early March, the kind of morning where the light came up gray and reluctant over the city, and the radiator in the kitchen ticked and groaned before it finally admitted defeat and produced heat, and Elias Vance stood at the stove in sock feet, flipping pancakes he had absolutely no business attempting given how little sleep he'd gotten, while his daughter sat cross-legged on a kitchen chair with a washable marker uncapped in one hand, waiting for him to hold still long enough for her to finish her work. "You moved," Amara said, not for the first time, with the weary patience of a 6-year-old artist forced to work with an uncooperative subject. "Daddy, hold your hand still or the star's gonna look like a spider." "My apologies," Elias said, holding his right hand flat and steady over the counter, palm down, the way he did every single weekday morning, rain or shine, good mood or bad. "Continue." "You also can't talk while I'm doing the points," she added, "because your hand moves when you talk. I don't know why, it just does." "Understood," Elias said, and clamped his mouth shut theatrically, which made her giggle despite herself, though she recovered quickly and returned to her work with renewed focus. The kitchen smelled like burnt sugar and coffee, the particular Thursday smell of a household running slightly behind schedule, and outside the window above the sink the sky had gone from gray to a slightly less committal gray, the kind of March morning that couldn't decide if it wanted to be winter or spring, and had settled, for now, on being neither. Elias flipped the second-to-last pancake a little too aggressively, and it landed half off the spatula, prompting a small gasp of protest from Amara that had nothing to do with her artwork and everything to do with pancake casualties. "You almost lost him," she said gravely. "I did not almost lose him. That was a controlled landing." "It did not look controlled." "Everything looks uncontrolled right before it works," Elias said, sliding the rescued pancake onto a plate. "That's just how landings go sometimes." She bent over his hand with her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, drawing a small 5-pointed star in blue marker on the back of his hand, just below the knuckles, the same spot every time, careful and slow, adding 2 little dots above it that were, she had explained to him more than once, not decoration but stars twinkling, which was different and which he should know by now. This had started nearly 2 years earlier, not long after Amara's mother died, when Amara had gone through a stretch of weeks where she refused to let her father leave for work without some kind of visible mark on him, something she could point to and know for certain he still belonged to her even while he was somewhere she couldn't see him. A therapist they'd seen for a handful of sessions had gently suggested it might be a way of managing the fear that people you loved could simply disappear one day without warning, the way her mother had, and had suggested letting the ritual continue rather than discouraging it, as long as it didn't become something that caused her distress if it was ever missed. It had started as a small dot on his wrist. Somewhere along the way it had evolved into a star, and the star had become, without either of them ever formally naming it that way, a kind of promise renewed every morning. "I'm still here, I'm still yours, I'll come back tonight." Elias never washed it off before it faded on its own, usually by early afternoon, no matter how much it complicated things when he had to shake hands in meetings, or more than once, when a colleague had asked with genuine curiosity why the CEO of a robotics company had a faded blue star on the back of his hand, a question he answered honestly and without embarrassment every single time. "Done," Amara announced, capping the marker with a decisive click and holding his hand up for both of them to inspect. "It's a good one today, very sparkly." "It's excellent, whoa." "RK," Elias said, and meant it, the same way he'd meant it roughly 400 and some mornings running. He was 41 years old, broad through the shoulders in the particular way of a man who had spent the first third of his working life doing physical labor rather than sitting behind a desk, with a short beard going gray faster at the chin than anywhere else, and hands that still, more than a decade after he'd stopped doing the work himself, carried the faint white scarring of a career spent around steel and torches, and the occasional mistake that had cost him more blood than he'd have liked. He kept his hair cut close, dressed most days in a way that made new employees at his own company occasionally mistake him for a maintenance contractor rather than the man whose name was on the building's lease, and had, hanging in the front closet of the apartment he shared with Amara, exactly one jacket he wore to every meeting that actually mattered to him, an old canvas work jacket, faded from tan to a color that didn't have a proper name anymore, with a torn seam along the left shoulder that he had never once, in 11 years, taken to a tailor to have repaired. That morning, as he flipped the last pancake and set it on Amara's plate, still holding his marked hand slightly away from his body the way you protect a wet painting, she asked him, through a mouthful of syrup, "Are you wearing the lucky jacket today?" "I am," he said, "big meeting." "Is it a good big or a scary big?" He considered the question seriously, because Amara asked most of her questions seriously and deserved the same in return. "Could be either," he said. "That's usually how the big ones are." The jacket in question was hanging on its hook by the front door, exactly where it always hung, and it had a story behind it that Elias had told Amara only in pieces. In the small, age-appropriate doses, a father learns to measure out over years, saving the fuller version for whenever she was old enough to hold the whole weight of it. He had been 26 years old, working as an ironworker on a high-rise construction crew downtown, the kind of job that paid well enough to feel like something, but that his own father, a retired postal worker who had wanted something office-bound and safer for his son, had never quite been able to stop worrying about. Elias had been good at the work, methodical and careful in a trade where carelessness got people killed, and he had liked it more than he expected to, liked the height and the wind and the particular quiet camaraderie of a crew that trusted each other with their lives 40 stories up. On a Tuesday in October, 11 years before the morning he stood flipping pancakes for Amara, a connector bolt had failed on a beam he was walking across, and he had gone down, caught himself on a safety line that had done exactly what it was supposed to do, and hung suspended for nearly 4 minutes, 41 stories above the street, while his crew scrambled to get him back onto solid steel. The jacket had torn along the shoulder seam during the fall, caught on a protruding bracket, and the tear had, in some strange and permanent way, become the only physical proof he owned of the day he should have died and hadn't. He had never had it repaired. He wore it, these days, only on the days that mattered most, not out of superstition exactly, though it functioned a little like superstition, but because it reminded him, every time his shoulder brushed against the frayed edge of that tear, what it felt like to be given a second chance he hadn't asked for and didn't waste. He had left ironwork 2 years after the fall, not because he was afraid of heights afterward, though for a while he had been, but because the 4 minutes hanging on that line had done something to the shape of his ambitions, had made him think hard about what he wanted the rest of his working life to look like. He remembered with total clarity, even 11 years later, the specific texture of those 4 minutes, the wind moving the line just enough to make him spin slowly, the sound of his own crew shouting instructions to each other above him, the strange, almost peaceful clarity that had settled over him somewhere around the second minute, once the initial panic burned itself out, a clarity that had let him notice, absurdly, the exact shade of orange the safety netting below him was painted, a detail that had never left him. He had gone back to school at night, studied mechanical engineering, and eventually, with two former crewmates and a small loan he'd nearly been laughed out of the bank for requesting, started a company that built safety monitoring robotics for high-rise and industrial construction sites, the exact kind of technology that, had it existed 11 years earlier, might have caught the bolt failure before it ever happened. The loan officer who'd nearly turned him away, a soft-spoken woman named Doris who worked at a community bank 2BL. Ox from his old apartment had asked him, near the end of that first meeting, why a man with a good, steady trade should risk everything on an idea that might not work. He had told her about the 4 minutes on the line, about the orange netting, about the sound of his crew's voices, and she had approved the loan the following week, a decision he had never forgotten and had, years later, quietly repaid by funding a small business grant program through that same community bank for tradespeople looking to start their own companies. He had named the company Robotics, a small private joke that only he and his old crewmates fully understood, a nod to the well of iron and the well-being both, and had built it, over 11 years, into a company with 380 employees, and a client list that included some of the largest construction and manufacturing firms in the country. He didn't dress the part of what people imagined a CEO should look like, and he had made peace with that a long time ago, mostly because dressing the part had never been the point. The point had always been the work, and the safety of the people doing it, and getting Amara to school on time with a star on the back of her father's hand. That particular Thursday carried more weight than most, because at 11 o'clock that morning, Ironwell was hosting a delegation from Halden Manufacturing, one of the largest industrial conglomerates in the country, for a final round of negotiations on what would be, if it closed, the largest partnership contract in Ironwell's history, a deal to integrate Ironwell's safety monitoring systems across every one of Halden's active construction and manufacturing sites nationwide. It had taken 8 months of negotiation to get to this point, and Elias' entire leadership team, 12 people in total, had cleared their calendars for the day, prepared briefing materials, and rehearsed the presentation twice the week before, because everyone understood exactly what closing this contract would mean for the company's next 5 years. Elias dropped Amara at school a little after 8, the same route as always, past the corner store where the owner kept a jar of lollipops by the register specifically, because Amara had once told him, at 4 years old with total sincerity, that his store was her favorite place in the world, past the fire station where the crew occasionally waved if they happened to be out front washing the truck, and walked her all the way to the classroom door the way he always did, crouching down to her eye level, adjusting her backpack strap, saying what he said every morning. "Have a good one, learn something, be kind to somebody." "You too," she said, the way she always did, and disappeared through the door, and he drove downtown toward Ironwell's headquarters with the star on the back of his hand and the torn jacket on his shoulders, thinking through the numbers he'd need to have ready in his head for the afternoon's negotiation. The drive gave him time to run through the shape of the day ahead. 8 months of negotiation had come down, in the end, to a handful of remaining sticking points, mostly around implementation timelines and data-sharing protocols between Ironwell's monitoring systems and Halden's existing plant infrastructure, the kind of detail that sounded dry on paper, but that Elias understood, better than most CEOs his size ever would, could mean the difference between a system that actually caught a failure before it happened and one that simply logged it afterward for the insurance paperwork. He had built his entire company on the conviction that the second kind of system wasn't good enough, that a monitoring platform which only explained what had already gone wrong was, in the end, a kind of expensive apology rather than a solution, and he intended to hold that line in the afternoon's negotiation, no matter how large Halden's market capitalization happened to be next to his own. He thought, too, about his old crew foreman, a broad, quiet man named Gus Pellerin, who had been the one shouting instructions up at him during those 4 minutes on the line, and who had, years later, been among the first people Elias called when Ironwell landed its first major contract. Gus had retired to Florida by now, but he still called every few months just to ask how the little robot company was doing, and Elias made a private note to call him that weekend and tell him about Halden, because Gus, more than almost anyone else alive, would understand exactly what a deal like this represented, coming full circle back to the exact kind of site where a bolt had once failed under both their boots. He spent the late morning walking the factory floor of Ironwell's testing facility, a converted warehouse 2 blocks from the company's main office tower, where the engineering team stress-tested new sensor arrays before they shipped, because he liked to see the actual hardware in motion before any meeting where he'd be talking about it in the abstract, a habit he'd never broken since his own days working with his hands. He'd crouch beside a testing rig for the better part of an hour, talking through calibration numbers with a lead engineer named Sophia Marchetti, watching a small yellow sensor unit clamp itself around a section of scaffold pipe and begin cycling through its stress simulation, tiny lights blinking green, then amber, then, once the simulated load exceeded the pipe's rated tolerance, a sharp, insistent red accompanied by an alert tone that Sophia had programmed herself, and was, by her own admission, prouder of than almost anything else she'd built that year. "If this had existed on your old crew," she said, watching the readout with him, "would it have caught the bolt before it failed?" "I think about that most days," Elias admitted. "Best answer I've got is probably, not for certain, but probably, and probably is worth building toward." He'd gotten a smear of grease across the frayed shoulder seam of the jacket in the process, reaching past a hydraulic arm to adjust a loose cable, and hadn't bothered to change before heading back to the main tower for the 2 o'clock meeting, because it had genuinely not occurred to him that anyone in that building would fail to recognize him. He walked the 2 blocks between the testing facility and the tower with his hands in his jacket pockets, past a coffee cart where the vendor, an older man named Tomas, called out his usual order without needing to be asked, past a construction site 3 doors down where 2 ironworkers on a break lifted a hand in greeting, having recognized him from a site visit Ironwell had done there the month before. Small, ordinary threads of a life built one recognized face at a time, none of which would matter in the slightest 90 seconds later, inside a mirrored elevator, to a man who had never seen his face before. He arrived at the tower's lobby a little before 1:40, badge already scanning him through the turnstiles the security guards had stopped even glancing up for years earlier, and pressed the call button for the executive elevator bank that ran express to the 40th floor, where the main conference room and his own office were located, still turning over a set of contract terms in his head, still faintly smelling of machine grease and cold testing floor air. He was not alone in the lobby. A small cluster of visitors in dark, precisely tailored suits stood near the security desk, checking in under the watchful, slightly nervous eye of the front desk staff, and Elias recognized, from a photo he'd been sent in a briefing packet the week before, the man at the center of the group. Marshall Kendrick, Chief Executive Officer of Halden Manufacturing, 56 years old, silver-haired, a man whose company had a market capitalization roughly 9 times the size of Ironwell's, and whose presence in this particular lobby, in person rather than by video call, signaled just how seriously Halden was taking the deal. Elias didn't introduce himself in the lobby. This was, in itself, a small and deliberate habit of his, one that had served him well more times than he could count over the years, letting a first meeting happen naturally rather than performing an introduction in a crowded lobby with cameras and onlookers. And besides, His own team had arranged to formally receive the Halden delegation upstairs, in the conference room, where introductions would happen properly. With coffee and name placards and the full choreography his head of business development had planned, he simply pressed the call button for the same elevator bank the Halden group appeared to be waiting for, nodded a polite, generic acknowledgement in their direction, the kind of nod strangers share in elevator lobbies everywhere, and waited. The doors opened. Elias stepped in first, moved toward the back corner out of habit, the way you do in a crowded elevator to leave room, and the Halden delegation filed in after him, 6 of them in total, filling most of the remaining space, with Marshall Kendrick positioning himself near the front, close to the panel of buttons, checking his watch with the particular impatience of a man who had flown 2 hours that morning and had exactly one topic on his mind. It was in the 3 or 4 seconds it took for the doors to close that Marshall Kendrick's eyes swept the small space, took in the grease-smudged canvas jacket, the torn seam at the shoulder, the faded blue star just visible on the back of the hand Elias had rested against the handrail, and made, in the particular unthinking way people sometimes do, a judgment about who belonged among the group he was traveling with and who did not. "You're headed to the 40th floor too?" Marshall asked, not quite a question so much as an expression of mild disbelief, glancing at his aide beside him with an expression that suggested he expected the answer to be, "No. I am," Elias said simply, keeping his tone even, unbothered, the tone of a man who had absolutely nothing to prove to a stranger in an elevator. "Maintenance call, or are you here about the loading dock?" Marshall asked, not unkindly exactly, but with the breezy confidence of someone who had never once had to consider whether a question like that might land as an insult. "We've got some sensitive people meeting upstairs in about 20 minutes, and I'd hate for there to be a mix-up with the freight elevator." Elias felt the small, familiar tightening in his chest that came with being misjudged in real time, a feeling he had encountered enough times across his life, in stores and restaurants, and memorably, at a bank counter the year he was applying for Ironwell's first business loan, that he had developed something close to a practice comm for it, though the comm cost something every single time, whether or not anyone watching could see the cost. "I'm not here about the loading dock," he said. "This elevator serves the 40th floor same as any other." Marshall's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, the expression of a man used to being agreeable in a way that cost him nothing, and he glanced again at the torn seam on Elias' shoulder, the grease smudge, the general state of a jacket that had clearly not been purchased with an executive floor in mind. "Whoever's dressing you for work these days ought to be fired," he said, "and so should whoever let you ride up here with actual executives." He said it lightly, almost as a joke, the kind of comment a certain type of powerful man makes when he assumes the room will laugh along, and one of his aides did, in fact, produce a small, uncomfortable chuckle, though it died quickly when it became clear the man in the jacket wasn't laughing. The elevator doors had already closed by then, sealing the 6 of them and Elias into the small, mirrored box together for the ride up, and Elias felt, in that instant, the particular vertigo of being trapped in a confined space with someone who had decided, with total confidence and zero evidence, exactly what category he belonged in. He thought, for one strange, floating second, of the connector bolt failing beneath his boots 11 years earlier, of hanging on that line 41 stories up with the torn shoulder of this exact jacket caught on a steel bracket, and of how strange it was that the closest he'd ever come to real physical danger had never once made him feel as small as being looked at like this could, in the space of an ordinary elevator ride, by a man who had known him for 11 seconds. "I appreciate the concern," Elias said, keeping his voice level, "but I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "I'm sure you are," Marshall said, in a tone that made clear he did not believe that at all, and turned his attention back to his phone, apparently satisfied that the matter had been settled, that the strange man in the torn jacket had been put politely enough in his place, and that they could all now proceed with their morning without further interruption. One of Marshall's aides, a younger man standing near the back of the elevator, close enough to Elias to have gotten a clearer look at him than the others, had gone very quiet during the exchange. His name was Priyanth Rao, 29 years old, 3 years into his role as a junior associate on Halden's corporate development team, and he had spent a significant portion of the last 2 weeks preparing briefing materials for this exact meeting, materials that had included, among the financial projections and technical specifications, a leadership bio page with photographs of Ironwell's executive team, a page he had personally proofread twice for typos the week before because his manager had been particularly exacting about it. He was looking now at the faded blue star on the back of the man's hand, at the specific shape of his face beneath the beard, and something in the back of his memory was starting, slowly and with a rising sense of dread, to click into place. The elevator climbed, floor numbers ticking upward on the small display above the door, 12, 18, 24, and Elias stood in the corner, hands still resting on the rail, saying nothing further, offering no correction, no defense, no explanation because some part of him, the same part that had learned to run his father's old arithmetic about which moments were worth spending, had already decided this was not a moment he intended to spend arguing with a stranger in an elevator. He would let the floor numbers do the talking. He always did eventually. Marshall, apparently encouraged by the silence into thinking his point had been well received, glanced once more at Elias, this time at the star on his hand rather than the jacket. "And what's that some kid drew on you?" he asked, with the same easy, careless amusement, gesturing vaguely with 2 fingers toward Elias' hand. "Cute, my grandkids used to do that. Usually grows out of it by kindergarten though, the marker thing. You might want to have a word with whoever's in charge of you at home." It was in some ways a smaller comment than the one about the jacket, almost an afterthought, tossed off without much thought behind it at all, and it might have landed, on a different day, as nothing more than a minor irritation. But Elias felt it land somewhere different, somewhere closer to the bone, because the star on his hand was not, in fact, a small thing to have grown out of. It was a promise renewed every single morning between him and a 6-year-old girl who had lost her mother and had spent 2 years making sure her father carried some small, visible proof that he would come back to her every night. It was, in its own quiet way, the realest thing in that entire elevator, realer than the contract they were all riding up to negotiate, realer than the suits and the watch and the easy confidence of a man who had clearly never once had to explain to a grieving child why people you love sometimes simply don't come home. He thought of his father, the retired postal worker who had never quite stopped worrying about his son's choice to climb steel for a living, and who had said to him once, not long before Elias left ironwork for engineering school, that the hardest part of watching your son do dangerous work wasn't the height. It was knowing that if something ever went wrong up there, the world would spend more time deciding whether it had been his fault than it would spend grieving him. His father had been talking about the specific kind of scrutiny a black man's mistakes tended to receive compared to everyone else's, the way blame arrived faster and stuck longer, and Elias had carried that warning with him through every job site, every safety briefing, every meeting he'd ever walked into wearing clothes that told people exactly the wrong story about who he was. He thought about all of that in the 3 seconds after Marshall Kendrick suggested his morning marker drawing was something he ought to have grown out of by kindergarten, and he made, in those 3 seconds, the same decision his father had taught him to make decades earlier without ever quite using the word decision. He would not spend this moment. He would let it cost Marshall Kendrick something instead, later, in the only currency that actually mattered, which was the truth, arriving in its own time. Still, Elias did not raise his voice. He did not correct him. He simply said, evenly, "My daughter drew it. She's got her reasons. I'm happy to leave it exactly as long as she wants it there." Something in his tone, some quiet, unhurried steadiness underneath the words, made Marshall glance at him again, this time with the faintest flicker of something less certain than before, though it passed quickly, smoothed back over by the confidence of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where nobody ever seriously pushed back on him. "Fair enough," Marshall said, in the tone of someone closing a minor subject rather than reconsidering it, and turned back to his phone. Priyanth, standing near the back, had gone through his mental filing system twice now and had landed, with a small, sinking certainty, on exactly where he'd seen this man's face before. He remembered the leadership bio page. He remembered, specifically, a line in the CEO's biography he had read twice while proofreading, a detail that had stuck with him because it was unusual for an executive bio to include something so personal. Elias Vance began his career as a structural ironworker, an experience that continues to inform Ironwell's mission to protect the people who build the world with their hands. He remembered, too, the photograph beside that bio, a man in a canvas work jacket, arms crossed, standing in front of a testing rig rather than posed in a studio the way most executive headshots were, a deliberate choice he'd assumed at the time, meant to communicate something about the company's values. He was looking now at that same jacket, torn at the shoulder, smudged with fresh grease, worn by the same face from the photograph, standing 4 feet away from his own CEO in a moving elevator that was, at that very moment, 4 floors from the top. He opened his mouth to say something, felt the specific paralysis of a junior employee 3 years into a career, deciding whether to publicly contradict his own CEO in front of a stranger and 5 colleagues, closed it again. And then, as the elevator ticked past floor 36, made himself speak anyway, quietly, leaning slightly toward Marshall. "Sir," he said, low enough that it was almost private, though not quite low enough to escape the small space entirely, "I think that's Elias Vance." Marshall glanced at him, distracted, not quite processing. "What?" "The CEO," Priyanth said, a little more firmly now, aware that the elevator had 4 floors left in that. Whatever he was going to say, he needed to say it before the doors opened. "Of Ironwell. I proofread his bio for the briefing packet last week. That's him." There was a very specific kind of silence that followed, the sound of a man's confidence rearranging itself in real time, and Elias watched, with the particular calm of someone who had, in fact, known exactly who he was the entire ride, as Marshall Kendrick's face went through several stages in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, the beginning of dawning horror, and something underneath all of it that looked almost like fear, the fear of a man realizing, 4 floors from the top, that he had just spent the last 30 seconds insulting the person on the other side of the biggest deal his company had on the table this year. Behind Marshall, one of the other aides shifted her weight and glanced down at her own briefing folder, as though checking whether she, too, had somehow missed a detail everyone else had caught. And the elevator, which had felt cramped and ordinary 90 seconds earlier, now felt like the smallest room any of them had ever stood in. 6 strangers and a man in a torn jacket, waiting together for the doors to open on a truth that had been standing among them the entire ride. Marshall started and stopped, visibly recalculating everything he'd said in the last 90 seconds, the jacket comment, the loading dock comment, the comment about the star and the person in charge of him at home, all of it replaying behind his eyes at once. "I'm sorry I had no idea you were." "I know," Elias said, and his voice was still even, still calm, though there was something underneath it now, quiet and unmistakably firm. "That was the problem." The elevator reached the 40th floor with a soft chime, and the doors slid open onto Ironwell's executive reception area, where 12 people were already standing in a loose, expectant arc facing the elevator bank, exactly where Elias' head of business development had arranged for them to be, ready to greet the Halden delegation the moment the doors opened. His chief operating officer stood at the front, along with his general counsel, his head of engineering, his chief financial officer, and 8 more members of his leadership team, all of them dressed for the occasion, all of them turning toward the opening doors with practiced, professional smiles that were meant for the arriving Halden executives. The smiles did not falter when they landed on the man in the torn jacket standing at the back of the elevator. If anything, they sharpened into something warmer, more immediate. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vance," his chief operating officer said first, stepping forward. "Sir, the conference room's ready whenever you are," said his head of engineering, a half step behind her. "Good to see you, sir," said a third voice, and then a fourth, and a fifth, the greetings overlapping in the easy, familiar rhythm of a team that worked closely with him every single day, 12 executives in total, each one addressing him by name or by the simple, unadorned title that had nothing to do with the jacket he was wearing and everything to do with 11 years of work they had watched him do, greeting him exactly the way they always did, without a flicker of surprise at how he was dressed. Because none of them had ever needed the clothes to tell them who he was. Marshall Kendrick stood frozen just behind Elias' shoulder, watching 12 of the sharpest executives in the industrial robotics sector greet the man he had, 90 seconds earlier, suggested might need to be redirected to the freight elevator. And the color that drained from his face in that moment was not subtle. His own aides shifted uncomfortably beside him, none of them quite sure where to look, and Priyanth, standing near the back, allowed himself the very smallest, most private exhale of relief that he had said something when he did. "Marshall," Elias said, turning now, extending his hand, the star on the back of it faded but still faintly visible, "welcome to Ironwell. I was actually planning to introduce myself properly upstairs. I'm Elias Vance. I understand we've got a lot to talk about this afternoon." Marshall took the offered hand, his own grip noticeably less certain than it had been in the lobby 20 minutes earlier, and managed, after a beat, to say, "Mr. Vance, I owe you an apology. What I said in the elevator was completely out of line, and I have no excuse for it." "We can talk about that separately from the meeting if you'd like," Elias said, "or we can get straight to the contract. Your call. But I'd rather not run the negotiation with an unaddressed elephant in the room, so it's up to you which one we deal with first." There was a pause, the kind of pause where a man decides in real time what kind of person he is going to be remembered as by a room full of witnesses, and Marshall, to his credit, did not try to sidestep it. "Yes. Can we have 5 minutes before the meeting starts?" he asked. "Just the two of us." Elias glanced at his chief operating officer, who gave a small, imperceptible nod, already reading the room and adjusting the schedule without needing to be asked, and led Marshall to a small private office just off the reception area, while the rest of the two delegations settled into the conference room with coffee and the low murmur of pre-meeting small talk. Inside the office, with the door closed, Marshall Kendrick, chief executive officer of a company 9 times the size of Ironwell, stood for a moment without speaking, running a hand over his jaw, the way a man does when he's trying to figure out how to say something he's never had much practice saying. "I've been doing this a long time," he finally said, 31 years in manufacturing leadership, and I want to tell you that what happened in that elevator isn't who I am. But the truth is, I don't actually know if that's true, because I don't know how many times I've done something like that to somebody who just didn't have a junior associate standing next to me willing to correct me before it mattered." He shook his head. "My father ran a plant floor for 20 years. I grew up around men who looked exactly like you, doing exactly the kind of work your jacket says you used to do, and somewhere between there and here, I apparently decided that kind of work, and the people who do it, stop being worth basic respect the second they're not signing my paycheck. That's an ugly thing to realize about yourself in an elevator in front of your own team." Elias listened without interrupting, the same patient stillness he'd shown throughout the ride up, watching the man across from him work through something that looked, for the first time since the elevator doors had opened, genuinely uncomfortable rather than merely embarrassed. He had seen plenty of apologies over the years, from contractors, from vendors, from the occasional employee who'd made a bad call. And he had learned, mostly through trial and error, to distinguish the ones that were actually about the other person from the ones that were, underneath the words, still mostly about the apologizer's own discomfort at having been caught. "And I understand if this changes how you want to proceed today," Marshall added, before Elias could respond. "If you'd rather push the meeting or bring in someone else from my side to lead the rest of the negotiation, I'll arrange it. I won't take it personally." "I want to be clear about something, though," Elias said, once Marshall had finished. "I wasn't offended because you didn't know who I was. I've spent a lot of my life being underestimated by people who didn't know who I was, and most days I've made peace with that because eventually the work speaks for itself. What actually landed on me was the comment about my daughter. She's 6. She lost her mother 2 years ago, and drawing that star on my hand every morning is how she manages being scared I might not come home either. That's not a kid thing to grow out of. That's a kid figuring out how to survive something most adults never have to. I'd ask you to think about that the next time you're in an elevator with somebody you've decided you already understand." Marshall was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became a kind of answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost most of the polish it had carried 20 minutes earlier in the lobby. "My wife passed 6 years ago," he said quietly, almost as though he were surprised to hear himself say it. "My youngest, he was 11 at the time. He used to leave notes in my briefcase for about a year afterward. I never told anyone that. I stopped finding them eventually, and I remember being almost sad about it, like it meant he was doing better, which he was, but some part of me missed opening the briefcase and finding one." He shook his head slowly. "I should have recognized what I was looking at on your hand. I didn't, because I wasn't actually looking at you. I was looking at a jacket and deciding a story about it before I let myself see anything else." "Understood," Marshall said, and for the first time since the elevator doors had opened, he looked less like a man managing a mistake and more like a man who had actually heard something. The meeting that followed ran nearly 4 hours, longer than scheduled, and by the end of it, the core terms of the partnership had been agreed to in principle, with a formal signing planned for 3 weeks later. The room had settled, after the first tense 20 minutes, into something closer to normal business rhythm. Elias' chief financial officer walking the Halden team through implementation cost projections. His head of engineering fielding detailed technical questions about sensor latency from a Halden operations director who had clearly done her homework. And somewhere around the second hour, the specific sea. Harge in the air that had followed everyone in from the elevator had finally, mostly, dissipated into the ordinary friction of two large organizations working out the fine print of a complicated agreement. Marshall himself said little during the middle stretch of the meeting, deferring more than usual to his own team, and Elias noticed it, the particular quiet of a man recalibrating not just his opinion of the person across the table, but something further back, something about his own habits that he was clearly still turning over. Twice, when one of his own aides began a sentence with a dismissive edge toward a junior member of Ironwell's team, a note-taker who had misspoken a technical figure and corrected herself immediately, Marshall cut in before Elias had to, softening the moment himself, an adjustment so small most of the room probably didn't register it as anything at all, though Elias did. It was not, in the end, a deal that collapsed because of what had happened in the elevator, but it was also not a deal that closed as though the elevator had never happened. Ironwell's general counsel, at Elias' direction, added a clause to the final agreement requiring Halden site managers and executive staff to complete the same safety culture and respect in the workplace training Ironwell required of its own leadership team. A clause Marshall signed off on personally, without argument, and without anyone in the room needing to explain why it mattered. News of the elevator exchange moved through both companies in the days that followed, the way these things do, not through any official announcement, but through the accumulating retelling of 12 executives who had all witnessed at least the tail end of it. And within Halden Manufacturing, where Marshall Kendrick's reputation for bluntness was, by most accounts, already something employees had learned to navigate carefully, the story took on a particular weight. Priyanth Rao, for his part, found himself, in the weeks that followed, quietly regarded around the Halden offices as the associate who had corrected the boss in an elevator and survived it, a reputation he wasn't entirely sure how to carry. He mentioned it once awkwardly in a follow-up call with Elias' chief operating officer, admitting he'd half expected to be quietly reassigned to a smaller account as punishment for the embarrassment, and had instead found himself, 2 weeks later, promoted onto the senior deal team for the very partnership he'd nearly let slide past uncorrected. Marshall, it turned out, had specifically requested him for it, telling his own head of corporate development that he wanted people around him going forward who were willing to say the uncomfortable thing at the exact moment it mattered, rather than after. The story reached Halden's board within a week, not as a formal complaint, since Elias had specifically declined to file one, wanting to handle the matter directly rather than escalate it into something punitive, but through the kind of informal channel that boards inevitably hear things through anyway, whispered between a vice president and a board member at an unrelated dinner, then repeated, with each retelling slightly more dramatic than the last, until it reached the boardroom itself in a version that had Marshall nearly losing the entire contract on the spot, a version that was not quite accurate but that carried enough truth in it to matter. Marshall found himself, a month later, sitting through an uncomfortable but not career-ending conversation with Halden's board chair about executive conduct and the company's public reputation, a conversation that resulted in no formal sanction, but that Marshall would later describe privately as one of the more humbling hours of his professional life. The board chair, a measured woman named Constance Ibori who had built her own career in manufacturing operations before moving into governance, had not raised her voice either, Marshall noted afterward, with a kind of rueful irony he couldn't quite shake. She had simply asked him plainly whether the company's next generation of leadership was going to inherit a culture where a man's value was measured by his clothes, and let the question sit in the room until he answered it himself. What mattered more to Elias in the weeks that followed was not what happened to Marshall standing at his own company, which was, in the end, largely out of his hands and not really the point, but what Marshall chose to do once the immediate embarrassment had faded and he'd had time to actually sit with what he'd said. 6 weeks after the contract signing, Elias received an email from Marshall's office requesting a call, and when they spoke, Marshall told him about a decision he'd made. Halden Manufacturing, he explained, was establishing a new scholarship fund for apprentice ironworkers and welders enrolled in trade programs at 3 technical colleges near its major manufacturing hubs, full. Why funded, no strings attached, named not after Marshall or Halden but, at Marshall's specific insistence over the objection of his own communications team, the Vance Apprenticeship Fund. I thought about naming it something more generic, Marshall admitted on the call. My PR people wanted something that didn't put your name on anything, in case it looked like we were trying to buy back a headline. But I decided I wanted your name on it specifically, because I want every kid who gets that scholarship to know it exists, because a man in a torn jacket stood in an elevator and didn't let me talk down to him, and because I had to actually sit with that and figure out how to be better. I'd rather they know the real reason than a comfortable one. Elias hadn't expected that, and it took him a moment to respond. That's a real gesture, he finally said. I appreciate it. I'd ask one thing, though, if you're serious about the name. Name it, Marshall said. Let me help pick the first class of recipients, Elias said. I know what it looks like to be underestimated walking onto a job site. I'd like a say in who gets the chance. Marshall agreed without hesitation, and the following spring, Elias sat on a small selection committee that awarded the fund's first 6 scholarships, one of them to a 19-year-old welding apprentice named Keisha Odom, who had been working 2 part-time jobs to afford night classes and who cried, unself-consciously, when she got the call. A moment Elias thought about more than once in the months that followed, not because it undid anything that had happened in that elevator, but because it was proof that even a bad 30 seconds could, if a person was willing to actually sit with it, turn into something that outlasted the embarrassment by a long distance. He met Keisha in person a few weeks later, at a small reception the technical college held for the fund's inaugural recipients, and found her standing near the refreshment table in a blazer that still had the crease marks from being folded in a store shelf that morning, visibly nervous, visibly proud, holding a paper plate of cheese cubes she hadn't touched. "I looked up your company before I came tonight," she told him, a little shy about admitting it. "I read that you used to be an ironworker. I didn't believe it until I saw the picture. You don't look like the CEOs they show us in the business textbooks." "Neither will you, probably," Elias said. "That's not a bad thing to hear at 19. Took me a long time to believe it myself." "Did people ever tell you that you didn't belong somewhere? Because of how you looked, I mean, not because of your actual work." Elias considered how much to tell her, standing there with a paper plate of untouched cheese cubes and a blazer with store-shelf creases, and decided in the end that she deserved the honest version. "More times than I could count," he said. "Some of them mattered a lot at the time, and I've forgotten them completely now. A few of them I still remember exactly, word for word, years later. The trick isn't making it stop happening. I wish I could tell you it stops. It doesn't, not completely, not even once you've built something people can point to and say, look, he clearly belongs. The trick is deciding every single time that it doesn't get to be the last word on who you are. You get the last word, not them." Keisha nodded slowly, and Elias watched something settle in her posture, some small straightening, and thought, not for the first time since that afternoon in the elevator, that this, more than the contract itself, more than the 4 hours of negotiation, was probably the actual point of the whole ordeal, the part that would still matter 20 years from now, long after anyone remembered the specific terms of the Halden Partnership Agreement. He picked Amara up from her after-school program a little after 6 that evening, hours after the Halden delegation had left the building, and his leadership team had scattered back to their own offices to draft the follow-up materials the deal would require. And he found her in the reading corner of the program room, cross-legged on a beanbag, deep in a picture book about a bear who ran a bakery. Entirely unaware that her father had spent his afternoon absorbing an insult in an elevator, and then negotiating the largest contract of his career in the same 3-hour stretch. "Daddy, you look tired," she observed, closing the book and getting to her feet, tucking it under her arm to finish at home, a privilege the program allowed for its regulars. "Long day," he admitted, helping her into her coat. "Good day, though, mostly good." "Mostly." "Mostly," he said, and left it there, because some things a father decided in the moment weren't worth carrying into a car ride with a 6-year-old, not on the same day they happened, not until he'd had time to sit with them himself first. They stopped for dinner at a small diner 2 blocks from their apartment, a Thursday ritual they'd fallen into almost by accident a year earlier and had never quite abandoned, and Elias sat across the booth from her, half listening to her recap of the Bear Bakery book, half still turning over the afternoon in his mind, the torn jacket, the elevator, the star on his hand, the sound of 12 familiar voices saying his name the moment the doors opened, and thought, not without some private wonder, about how strange it was that both halves of his day, the ugliest 10 minutes and the most consequential 4 hours, had happened within an hour of each other, and neither one had managed to touch the quiet, ordinary happiness of a booth at a diner with his daughter narrating a story about a bear. Life at Ironwell, meanwhile, mostly returned to its ordinary rhythm in the weeks after the Halden deal closed. Elias kept walking the testing floor most mornings, kept wearing the same rotation of practical, unremarkable clothes to work, kept the torn jacket hanging on its hook at home for the days that called for it. And if his leadership team treated the whole episode as a story worth retelling at the occasional team dinner, half proud and half amused, they never once let it change the easy, unpretentious rhythm of how they worked with him day to day. Because none of them had ever needed a jacket to tell them who their CEO was in the first place. It was on an ordinary Tuesday nearly 4 months after the elevator ride, an evening with nothing scheduled and no meetings looming, the kind of evening where dinner was leftovers reheated a little unevenly, and the dishwasher ran loud enough that they'd both raised their voices slightly without noticing, that Elias sat at the kitchen table across from Amara, who had commandeered his hand again after dinner, marker uncapped, working with the particular concentration she reserved for her best efforts. "I heard you got in trouble at work," she said, not looking up from the star she was drawing, because Elias had, in fact, told her a simplified version of the story weeks earlier, the version appropriate for a 6-year-old, about a man who'd been rude to him in an elevator and then found out he was wrong to be. "I didn't get in trouble," Elias said. "The other man did a little, and then he tried to fix it." "Did he say sorry?" "He did." "Did you believe him?" Elias thought about that, about the 4 hours of negotiation, about the scholarship fund, about the way Marshall's voice had sounded on the phone 6 weeks later, less polished, more honest. "I did," he said. "Not right away, but eventually, yeah, I believed him." "How do you know when to believe somebody's sorry?" Amara asked. And there was something in the question, some flicker of an old worry surfacing sideways the way her worries often did, sideways rather than head-on, that made Elias set down his fork and give her his full attention. "You watch what they do after," he said. "Anybody can say sorry. It's what happens in the weeks and months afterward that tells you whether they meant it. Did they change anything? Did it cost them something real? Or did they just want the uncomfortable feeling to go away as fast as possible so they could go back to how things were?" He paused. "The man who was rude to me started something that's going to help a lot of kids learn a trade, kids who might not have gotten the chance otherwise. That took him weeks to put together. That's how I knew." Amara nodded slowly, filing this away the way she filed away most of the things he told her, to be produced again, unexpectedly, weeks or months later in some entirely different conversation. Amara nodded, satisfied with this, and bent back over his hand, adding the 2 small dots above her star, the twinkling ones, exactly as she always did. "Did he say anything about my star?" she asked, a little more quietly. Elias hesitated, weighing how much of the truth a 6-year-old needed to carry. "He said something not very nice about it at first," he admitted. "He didn't understand what it meant. I explained it to him, and I think he understood better after that." "You should tell everybody what it means," Amara said, with the flat, unshakable conviction of a child who had never once doubted the importance of her own rituals. "Then nobody would ever say something not nice about it again." "Maybe," Elias said, smiling. "Or maybe it's enough that you and I know what it means. Some things don't need explaining to everybody. They just need to matter to the 2 people they're actually for." She considered this, tilting her head the way she did when she was deciding whether to accept an idea or argue it further, and ultimately nodded, apparently satisfied, and held his hand up to the kitchen light to inspect her work. "Done," she announced. "Very sparkly. Extra sparkly, actually, because it's Tuesday and Tuesdays don't usually get a star, so this one's a bonus." "I'll wear it proudly," Elias said, and meant it same way. He'd meant it more times than he could count by now. She slid off her chair and padded over to the closet to retrieve her book bag for the morning, already moving on the way children do, from one small ceremony to the next without ever lingering too long on either. And Elias sat alone at the table for a moment, looking at the fresh star on the back of his hand, still slightly damp, the blue ink catching the kitchen light the same way it had caught it hundreds of mornings before this one. Later that night, after she was asleep, he stood for a moment by the front closet, looking at the old canvas jacket hanging on its hook, torn seam and all, and thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the same jacket that had once been mocked in an elevator by a man who assumed it meant nothing had also, in its own quiet way, been the thing that told the truth all along, long before anyone in that elevator was ready to hear it. He reached out and touched the frayed edge of the tier, the way he sometimes did without quite meaning to, and thought about Gus Pellerin shouting instructions up at him 41 stories above the street, and about a 19-year-old welding apprentice crying over a phone call, and about a 6-year-old girl asleep down the hall with a marker cap still loosely twisted shut on her nightstand, and understood in the quiet of the hallway that all of it, the fall and the tier and the star and the elevator, had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, added up to exactly the life he was standing in. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, even a little, please tap the like button. It genuinely helps stories like this find the people who need them. And down in the comments, tell me which moment hit you the hardest, because I read every single one.